This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Yes. Inside the Greens. It's everyone's favourite time, everyone. Our little book club. Thanks very much for being a patron of our show. We love you. Thank you for supporting us. You mean the world. This is a show about green politics in Australia. It's serious danger. It's not an official Greens Party podcast, etc., etc.
Yada, yada.
For this ep, we're finishing Chapter 5 of Inside the Greens by Paddy Manning, Breaking Through. Remind the good people, Emerald, what was the first half of this chapter all about?
First half of this chapter, well, the Greens had been born, Australian Greens had been born, got together, and then we tried to win an election. Weren't really successful in terms of the Australian Greens winning any elections, but we got some WA Greens elected to the Senate, and they fucked shit up and were pretty cool and interesting and were, I don't know, advising Gough Whitlam, or Gough Whitlam was advising them. There was, the Chopper Read saying that he was, someone had asked Chopper Read to assassinate Bob Brown during the 1993 election. That was cool.
For the low price of $500?
Yes, just $500, a real bargain. And I forgot we talked about the German Greens, the Germans as well, Patrick Kelly, and that party kind of dying, and then her dying and her partner dying.
Which is still unsolved, apparently. Yes,
yes. This is a true crime podcast, and I see that we've got some input from a listener, because we were saying in the book, it says that Christabel Chamarette, who would get these messages or calls from Gough Whitlam telling her what to ask in the Senate, etc., and she was like, I realised that he used to spend every day reading the Hansard, and whereas our patron Monique says he was probably listening to Parliament on the radio. Smiley face.
That makes a lot more sense, because we were like, how is he getting Hansard? There was no email.
That would make a lot more sense.
I guess so. What a cool guy sitting around all day listening to his old office, being like, these people suck. Oh, this Greens lady seems okay. I'll send her a letter.
If you could have like a live feed into your old workplace, what kind of mind would push you to actually streaming that all day? And then I guess if you then got to tell the people how to do it without having to tell them what they're doing wrong, what they should be doing, without having to do the job yourself. I don't know. Maybe it makes sense.
Why not? Good on you, Gough. The rest of the chapter is about the Greens breaking through, or not breaking through, depending on how you look at it, across the country in the lead up to and including the 1996 election, the big one.
A bad election.
Mr. Johnny Howard. Yeah, it was a bad one. Johnny Howard got back in. We kick off with a bit of an overview about how forestry is like the big issue that's propelling a lot of Greens representation out there. More than any other issue, it was the intensifying forest wars that propelled the first Greens into legislatures across the country.
Yeah.
Apparently there was like a hoo-ha. The Resource Assessment Commission delivered a 1,300-page report recommending a permanent forest estate. The Commonwealth and all states and territories except Tasmania committed to set aside a comprehensive, adequate and representative network of high conservation value forests while providing resource security for loggers. When the states dragged their heels, Paul Keating came up with the idea of using the Commonwealth's annual export wood chip licensing as a bargaining chip, threatening to reduce... Get it?
Yeah.
Threatening to reduce volumes by 20% a year for 5 years, all the way to zero, unless the states developed 20-year regional forest agreements. Controversial.
Yeah, I do have trouble. We've done like a little bit of a dig into forestry stuff before. I have to admit, I still find it hard. Famously, the documentary
in which Bob Brown is a tree, yes.
Bob Brown is a tree, yes. And yes. I swear there was another one as well where we were talking about, you were kind of explaining, the debate around how much goes to wood chipping and how much is pulp and all of that, particularly in Tasmania. And I've even tried, I read this book recently by Anna, someone, can't remember, called Into the Woods, and it's about logging in Tasmania and the politics of it all. And I feel like I just don't quite understand it. I find it hard to find, and I guess that's what this book was about. I find it hard to sift through the spin from the logging industry versus the environmental movement to be like, well, how can they say that actually, no, this is what's needed and this is, this is the impact on the forest and it's not that much. How could that be so wildly different from the reality? And
it's hard to
maybe I'm
appreciate
just-
outside of Tassie, right, about how massive this was. And it clearly defines the Labor-Green relationship in Tasmania for
That's
a
right.
very long time. And it is the quintessential environment versus class, economics, works, jobs. Yes. And clearly that's where a lot of union versus Greens shit has been going down.
Yes.
So, but yeah, and clearly
it's like the original coal mining, really, like in terms of, the fight. And maybe that's, I guess as someone who's like grown up in the Greens mostly around coal and climate, I feel slightly disconnected from the forestry stuff, even though it's clearly it's like a foundation for the party,
Right. It's a pretty good analogy. I mean, yes, workers, but also, I mean, there would be communities in Tasmania whose for a very long time, their entire economy and their identity as a town or a place.
Yes, it's like a whole cultural thing.
Logging, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like Keating didn't manage it particularly well during this period. We learned that Jim Scott becomes the first Green elected in WA. He fights to save forestry. He wins on his first attempt, and he stays there for 12 years. Pretty impressive. But this threat that Keating makes pisses off a lot of workers and the CFMEU. What followed would go down as one of the dirtiest episodes in Labor history. Loggers descended on Canberra from all over the country at the end of January, surrounding Parliament House with their trucks. The optics were terrible for the government, and the salt in the wound was that the demonstration was led by a Labor-affiliated union. Enraged, Keating considered calling in the army.
Good. Paul Keating rules. That's awesome. You should definitely call in the army on the fucking union.
Jesus. This is interesting. I thought Judith Ajani, author of The Forest Wars, described the blockade as a curtain raiser for John Howard's return to lead the opposition that same week, and wrote that Australian voters witnessed the first display of Howard's battlers versus Keating's special interest elites, the core of a meticulously crafted election strategy to capture more of the 1990s middle class vote. The battlers.
Howard's battlers.
Which you saw sort of repeated around the carbon tax stuff too, right? Like the same kind of convoy on Canberra, or like, pitting truckers against environmental considerations as well. It's a tried and true tactic.
Which is, and this, I don't know if you will get into any of this later on, but I noticed there were a few times in this chapter where they talk about the rhetoric of the Greens being around not us now, but them then. It's this fully like just disregarding the material needs of people today in order to invest in this kind of nebulous positive future, which I get. And I know there are still a lot of particularly older people in the Greens who that's what they think the Greens is all about, but it's so easy. Like, it's got to be fucking hard to win people's votes then when you're telling them, oh no, well, you have to completely sacrifice your life now. We don't care about that. And if you're a good person, you won't care about that because you have to just care about the future.
Yeah. So just to be clear, I think you said them then, but it's not us now, them later.
Not us now, them later. Yeah. How awful does that sound? Them later. Great. Why would I want to fight for that? Who? When?
You vote now for them later. What about me now?
What about me now? What about my family now, Bob Brown?
It's tough because, I think we need long-term thinking in our politics. Our politicians should be able to talk about that. We should be able to think beyond the election cycle. But it's not an incredible message. I mean, talking about people's kids and the future of their kids, that's one thing. But it's sort of, it's very them later. Who's them?
Them later is terrible.
Speaking of bad politics, we also get a whole bunch of instances of the Greens fully helping out the Tories in state and territory elections in the lead up to 1996. Did not enjoy reading this, I'll be honest with you.
Nobody's perfect, I guess.
Nobody's nerfect. Because I guess, as the Greens are sort of becoming more of a thing, we're a federal party now, running in lots of elections, the questions of where our preferences go and what do you do to bargain for that kind of support? Do you just say, obviously you can't just say we support Labor no matter what. You want to extract concessions and put political pressure as much as you can. But that looks pretty ugly. The Greens, who had been on standby for a snap election since 1994, hinted that when it came, they might direct their preferences to the coalition. One article quoted Tasmanian Greens leader Christine Milne, "It is really extraordinary how far back we are meant to remember in order to be grateful to Labor. How long are they going to make us remember the Franklin River?"
I mean, true.
That's totally true, and that's a classic. We love Labor running through their record ages ago and saying, therefore we're good now and vote for us no matter what.
Yeah, be grateful.
Territory election in the ACT, I think this is 95 maybe or 96. Greens debuted with 9% of the vote, which is
Not
pretty
bad.
incredible. This is in the Hare-Clark system, the proportional representation. But then we have this. The Liberals won 7 seats, Labor 6, the ACT Greens 2, plus progressive leading independents Michael Moore and former Raiders footy star Paul Osborne. Combined, Labor, the Greens, the Democrats and Moore won 52% of the vote. Labor, the Greens and Moore could have formed a government.
Great.
There was consternation inside the Greens that Tucker and Horodnoy would back the Liberals, and a meeting of members debated at length, but ultimately Moore sided with Carnell, and when it came to a vote, the 2 new Greens followed suit.
Carnell being the Liberals, right?
Yes, sided with,
Yeah.
yes, sorry, the leader of the Liberals, apologies, yes. Tucker's first move was to tell the Assembly, our decision to allow Mrs. Carnell to work as Chief Minister is by no means an endorsement of the Liberal policies.
Right. Okay.
We tend to work at this place issue by issue. We also look forward, quite probably, to working on many occasions with Labor in opposition and with the other independents. What do we think about this?
So I still didn't quite understand reading this why they didn't just form government with Labor given that they could. Is it because they determined that the Liberals were actually better on forestry than Labor, or was it just about like punishing Labor even if the Liberals would be worse?
The chapter doesn't go into detail sort of were the big issues at play here necessarily. I guess, yes, forestry was out there as an issue. Maybe it was the classic, well, the Liberals won more seats, therefore it's more representative of what the people want to go with them. But that's not good logic at all because you could form the government yourself.
Well, especially,
of the vote.
Yeah, 50, that's right, exactly.
Oh, ACT Greens. And, well, I guess, that's in the 90s. And then, of course, now we have this long-standing sort of coalition government between ACT, Labor and Greens that sees Greens members in ministries and stuff. So that's good, I suppose. But, yeah, I didn't realise that they propped up a coalition government.
No, I didn't either.
We also learned that in New South Wales, the No Aircraft Noise Party ran and won big in the Inner West.
The original. It's actually what the Queensland Greens modelled our 2022 federal election campaign on. The NAN.
Really?
No.
NAN.
I thought this was so funny because I'd never heard. It was surprising to me that this was a big election issue in a previous election because of obviously all the takes that the 2022 election, like we won those breakthrough Brisbane seats because of our campaigns around flight noise, which is silly. Like it's an example of a community campaign that they ran.
Well, yeah, Sydney opened up a third runway in late 1994, and so you get this one-issue party, No Aircraft Noise, setting up. They won 24.6% of the primary vote.
That's insane.
That's insane. But I guess reflects community sentiment. Finishing with 40% of the two-party preferred. So they did well. Sylvia Hale, later a Greens MLC, got elected for NAN in Marrickville Council in September that year.
Amazing. Yeah, so because it was the same thing in Brisbane, right? It was a new runway opened at Brisbane Airport, and lots of people have had their sleep disturbed and are pretty angry about it.
I wonder, isn't there? There's a whole other airport being built in Western Sydney, isn't there?
Is there?
I don't know if people are angry about that. Then we learned about the 1996 Queensland state election. Was it 96 or 95?
I thought it was 95.
Okay, 95. My mistake there. Which Paddy Manning describes as a turning point in the history of the Greens. All gets very messy. How much did you know about this, Emerald?
I didn't. I have to claim that I was busy being born that year. So
okay.
If it was 95. Yeah, I didn't know about this, and I actually was even confused. So it's the big issue was this road, right? And I don't know what this road proposal was. It does not ring bells.
Right. I guess it never happened in the end?
No, I guess not.
Let's lay it out. You got the Labor Party's in power. Of course, Joe Bjelke-Petersen finally ends his reign of terror in the late 80s. Labor Goss government takes over. And they're going into the election. They're a little bit on the nose. Drew Hutton from the Queensland Greens flagged publicly that Labor could not take the Green support for granted. One Greens party source said, "You can bet your boots no party will get across the board preferences." Bet your boots. The looming issue was a proposed toll road from Brisbane to the Gold Coast, which would cut through Australia's largest koala habitat. The Goss government was originally opposed, but backflipped after receiving advice that Queensland's population growth demanded the road be built. So it proposed an expensive compromise, a $50 million plus cut and cover tunnel under the state forest.
Tunnel. I even missed that detail. Right. How silly.
Under a state forest, yeah, gosh. Conservation groups and many voters in the affected electorates preferred that the toll road was not built at all. The coalition promised to shelve the project completely. Both sides put considerable effort into wooing the Greens. As one wag put it, Labor State Secretary Mike Kayser donned the koala suit to negotiate preferences with them. Among other measures, Labor promised a massive new Cape York wilderness area as large as Kakadu. For national environmental groups such as the ACF and the Wilderness Society, this was enough to justify advocating a vote for Labor. But not for the local Green groups, who accused the pig bodies of being Labor stooges. Sound familiar?
Nice.
And certainly not for Hutton or the Queensland Greens, who decided to recommend voters preference the coalition in 3 marginal seats and put Labor last. The environmental movement split bitterly, and the accusations flew thick and fast.
Spicy.
Whatever deal had been negotiated, it was the first time in Australian history the Greens had directed preferences against Labor and in favour of Conservative parties. If the intention had been to give Labor a scare, the plan worked better than expected. The coalition won all 3 marginal seats with Greens preferences, and a hung parliament was returned with devout Christian independent Liz Cunningham in Gladstone, also elected on Green preferences, holding the balance of power. Goss only just retained government. The last contested seat, Mundingborough, went to Labor by 16 votes, partly due to preferences for the Green candidate, who had polled over 11%. Hutton did best, polling 24% in Mount Cootha, laying the foundations of a Greens win there 2 decades later.
Future Maywa.
That's Maywa. Okay, right, gotcha.
Yeah.
So, and we'll come back to this again. I mean, it comes up as like a recurring theme about, the Greens with their massive focus on the environment, coming out of the environment movement and their collaboration with the environment movement, generally saying, well, Labor sucks here, so we're actually going to direct our preferences to the Tories.
Yeah. And this is such a significant project that we think this is, a big enough threat to Queensland that this is what we're going to risk everything. This is what we're putting all our eggs in this basket to try and just stop this road. I also I think it's worth pointing out that they're saying not only that it went through the forest, because then they were like, oh, we'll go under the forest, but it's a toll road, which is fucked. And I imagine that would have been part of it, right? Although I guess it's not necessarily a privatised toll road, because we have a bunch of these that I'm pretty sure the Labor government, don't quote me on that actually, one of them fucking privatised all of our tolls around Brisbane. And so there are these private toll companies making bank off what used to be publicly owned roads. But I guess there's no suggestion here that it's a privatised one. So maybe it was just about the koalas.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is the thing that's coming through. I mean, and I think this is reasonable at the time as to where the Greens have come from. But at this point, the Greens' number one priority is the environment. They're also railing against economic rationalism and, they have social and economic policies. But at least I think the expectation that they have of themselves and that voters have of them is that they prioritise the environment as their number one issue. So I guess from their point of view, they are putting far less emphasis on other matters, I suppose. And therefore, on the crucial environmental issue, they will go for the party that is not going to do that. I mean, I don't know the other policies that the Queensland Liberal opposition had other than to not do this horrific tunnel. But, they just promised to shelve the project completely. Whether that was going to do fantastic stuff for the environment was a bit, up in the air, I suppose.
Yeah, it used to be all about roads as well, didn't it? It's like forests and roads. Roads aren't as big an issue anymore. It's all about mines, I guess, mines and gas fields. But roads used to be the big one. I remember we did that, or we mentioned this in a Christmas Day episode a couple of years ago when we were talking about Bob Brown's Stop Adani convoy. And then we also talked about the Daintree blockade in the 80s, and that was about that road between Cape Tribulation and York, maybe? Anyway, up in North Queensland.
Yeah, right. Peter Singer enters the scene in this chapter as well. Do you know much about Peter Singer?
A little bit. Yeah. What do you think of him?
Well, he looms large in my brain because I did a first-year uni philosophy course when I was in year 12. And so we were reading ethics.
You did a first-year university course when you're in year 12. Oh, la-di-da. Yes,
I didn't do maths or science. So I read a bunch of his stuff on there on, euthanasia, the ethics around abortion, his stuff on the great apes as well. He thinks apes are cool and think apes should be given personhood. All that stuff's very interesting.
Oh, I didn't know about that part. I thought his whole thing was, isn't he's against speciesism, right? Like he's a vegan on that basis that we shouldn't discriminate against other animals just because they're not human.
Yes.
So we shouldn't eat them, obviously.
Yes. And perhaps more controversially sort of suggested the idea that bestiality could be okay if the animal's into it.
Another green who's into – oh, no, it was pedophilia, wasn't it? Sorry, not bestiality.
Yes. Very different.
Great. We've got some good stuff going on. I thought his more controversial stuff was around the ethics of like around disability, right? And like verging on some eugenics kind of what's the word? Discourse. But yeah, like framing around whether it's better for a disabled person to be alive or dead, and his view that you can maybe decide for that person that their life is not worth living.
That's certainly the spicy end of the Peter Singer world. Yes, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And lighter news, much funny clip of him being on Q&A and someone asked him about his views on bestiality, and I think Helen Coonan, I think her name was. Anyway, the conversation got to a point where Helen Coonan was talking about her Labrador, and everyone started laughing because all they could imagine was Coonan making love to her dog. Anyway, horrific. Peter Singer is a big figure of the Greens in the 90s. He writes the book The Greens with Bob Brown. Have you read or heard about that one?
Are we going to have to do another series?
We can read that book too if you want.
Book club, The Greens. Have you read it?
I haven't, no, but I remember talking to a bunch of Greens people over the course of my podcast, and it came up quite a few times. People like, I read that book. That's what made me think about the Greens or join the Greens or take them seriously.
Paddy Manning says it's good, like says basically more people should read it.
I think so. Well, he's sort of like, there aren't many political parties that have sort of a book that is like, this is the philosophy or this is the thinking behind the party, at least manifesto. At that time, according to one of its key leaders and founders. Brown and Singer's main charge was the Greens represented the most profound worldwide transformation of politics since the rise of socialism more than a century ago. The book's preface plants a stake in the ground. The Australian Greens are not a ginger group seeking to win just a few seats or to persuade the old parties to adopt a green tinge. The Greens aim to transform politics and bring about green, capital G, government.
Pretty cool. And, I mean, do we just need to show Advance Australia this and be like, look, it's not new. We would never, like, it's been right there in front of your faces all along. They should put clips from this book in their little ads about the Greens not being just tree huggers anymore.
Not who they once were, yes. I'm sure they listen to reason and incorporate that into their campaign. The book defended the still raw decision by the Queensland Greens to give some preferences to the Nationals. As long as Labor parties believe they will always get Green preferences, they have no incentive to get serious about dealing with environmental and social problems. They can always say, you'll still have to give us your preferences because we are not as bad as the Conservatives. And in the same way, if the Conservatives can never hope to win Green preferences away from Labor, they have no incentive to develop better social or environmental policies. After the 1995 Queensland election, no party can take Green preferences for granted. I mean,
it's interesting, right? Like it makes me, because obviously, yes, like you, my initial response, you say, like anyone suggests that the Greens would recommend preferences or direct preferences to the LNP over Labor. And I'm like, that's anathema to the party as a whole. We should never do that. That's so stupid and ridiculous. And then, but it is true. It is similar to the balance of power negotiating position that it's like, if you just promise that you're going to support Labor no matter what, then you lose a whole lot of negotiating power. I think I'm like now, I don't know that preference negotiations could work in the same way. Like maybe it was more possible then that they could achieve a real outcome on an issue that they thought was important or that a lot of voters thought was important by like through the way that they direct preferences. Whereas I just don't actually think that would happen now because again, like we spoke about this last episode about how preferences were that was the Greens' power back then, whereas now we're about winning seats and like probably the impact that doing something like that with preferences could have on our primary vote would be make it not worth it, you know?
Yeah, I think it's tough. It's like, I mean, we have to be about a third way or a third, like an alternative way, right? We have to be about something more than just either of these two options. That's the reason for our existence as a minor party, right? So, of course, we can't just automatically preference one party over the other now. But I think what's changed significantly between the Greens in the 90s and the Greens now is, yes, a broader policy program and a a stronger concern for other issues, so that the cost of a Conservative government, even if they have worse environmental policies, is something to be taken very seriously for the effect it'll have on ordinary people.
Yeah, and you have to, and I mean, this is all without saying, it still does frustrate me when we have these conversations about that kind of overstate the influence of how to vote cards and, quote unquote, directing preferences. It gives some stats around the gap, from 60 to 75% of preferences would go to one party over the other when they're on Greens how to vote cards.
I think it's 75% of Greens voters. 75% of Green voters would follow the how to vote cards that Greens would put out there. That dropped to 60% if it was a split ticket for whatever reason. So
okay. But even so, it's but that could be they're not necessarily just following that because it's on the card, for example. It is probably because that generally would align with the position of the Greens and their base at that point in time. So. Yeah, it is. I think it's a worthwhile thing to think about in terms of our negotiating position and how that's impacted by what we say we're going to do with the other parties. But I don't know. The Libs are pretty bad, hey?
Well, you heard it here first, folks.
Yeah.
Again, if the environment is your number one issue and your purpose of being, I can understand a scenario in which you would play that game. I guess I just think the party's in a place now where they're there is no universe in which we would take a Conservative government over a Labor government at the state or federal level anytime.
Yeah, and Queensland, I don't know how definitively other states do this. There's the NT obviously has done it relatively recently. But in Queensland, we're generally quite definitive even before the ballots of the members have been held that we will be preferencing Labor above the LNP. Even though that's technically decided by members, we usually will just say that because, that's always what the members tend to vote for. So
what they want, yeah. We brief touch in on Tasmania here as well. There was a state election going on. Bob Brown gets pre-selected for the Senate campaign for the federal election coming up. The federal party is broke, apparently, as is Bob himself. Apparently, Bob Brown is all out of money. They're like, guys, stop asking him to fork out money to fly to your event. He has no income. He's not a doctor and he's not an MP anymore. God damn.
Yeah. Couldn't he do doctoring? I guess he was busy.
Busy
trying to save the world.
There was a quote he thought he'd just get on the lecture circuit, and apparently that just didn't happen.
Yeah. Sad.
No one wanted the electrifying presence of Bob Brown at their corporate event. There's a state election in Tasmania in 1996. Christine Milne becomes the leader of the Tas Greens with no party process whatsoever. Wonderful stuff.
Good.
She opposes a 40% pay increase for parliamentarians. Good call there,
that actually
Christine,
is good.
This is very unpopular. More forestry wars going on. There was a proposed road through the Tarkine forest, which Greens members protested. Bob Brown protested, got arrested.
Stop
Another
the roads. Stop the roads party.
The roads, yes. There were genuine concerns in the party that Brown getting arrested would jeopardize his Senate candidacy. I don't know whether they meant legally or reputation-wise.
I took that to mean legally, but maybe, right. Yeah. Because he'd already been arrested, hadn't he? Surely.
People loved him for being arrested.
Yeah,
this is why we love Bob Brown.
That's his thing. So I assume that they meant something about legally.
Okay.
If he was convicted.
The MP's pay in the forests helped drive a backlash against the Groom government in the election, although the Greens also suffered a 2% statewide swing against them under Milne, partly due to the rise of a pop-up party, the extremely greedy 40% extra party, opposing the pay rise for MPs.
I love funny party names, extremely greedy. It's confused because it's not the stop the extremely greedy 40% extra party.
Yes.
It sounds like you are the party for the extremely greedy 40% extra. And yet people clearly knew what they were. I don't suppose that many people were voting for the extremely greedy 40%. So
maybe it was a satire. They were doing bits oh, we're greedy. Num, 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 num. I don't know. But it's pretty incredible that you would register a party like that. There was the Beer and Excise Party, I think, at one point too, that ran for quite a few elections, just trying to get rid of the tax on beer. The Reverend Lance Armstrong, author of Good God, He's Green, which we've talked about before, lost his seat of Bass after introducing a censorious private members bill to restrict the advertising or display of soft porn magazines like People and Playboy.
Oh,
Despite the
mate.
loss, the Greens' 4 seats could have united with Labor's 14 to reach a majority of 18, and Milne expected to go into negotiations with opposition leader Michael Field. In perhaps the only example of a political party actively denying itself power, Field refused to deal with the Greens and chose to remain in opposition.
Only example, Mr. Paddy Manning. Well, 2024 called. It would like to
Yes.
chat.
Again, this is from 2018. Incredible that it's happened in Tasmania again. What is wrong with the Labor Party down there? What are they doing?
I don't know. They just really hate us. They really hate the Greens.
Maybe it's a forestry thing. I don't know. Like Field, Liberal Premier Ray Groom had promised to govern in majority or not at all, as they always do. He described the Greens as the Liberals' arch enemies. After the election, the Liberals' self-interest kicked in. He was replaced by Tony Rundle, who was willing to govern in minority. So an unpopular Liberal government lived on after 1996. Under Milne's leadership, the Greens were able to rack up wins on legislation by collaborating: gun reform in the wake of Port Arthur, the decriminalisation of homosexuality after gay rights activists took the state to the UN and High Court, and joining the Tasmanian Parliament's historic apology to the stolen generations. Notwithstanding these achievements, both major parties were determined to reform the lower house, reducing the number of seats in a stitch-up expressly designed to rid the Parliament of the Greens once and for all.
Yeah, they really just... it's the forestry stuff, right? Like, it just seems like people get so unhinged about it. That is one thing that was clear from this book. I'm pretty sure the author's name is Anna Crean. But it's always just been... It's personal. Like, it is deep.
Well, particularly for Bob Brown, as he is a tree.
As a tree himself, that's right.
It's pretty amazing. Yeah, so they changed those parliament laws in Tasmania, which as we know, got reversed. And this 2024 Tasmanian election was the first time that the House was expanded.
How long later?
So that more Greens could
20, 30 years? I don't know. Not good at maths.
Quite a while. All right, then we come to the 1996 election with more preference warring going on, and the question of preferences come up once more. Although Brown and the Greens publicly defended the preference decisions taken by Drew Hutton in the 1995 Queensland election, behind the scenes, the party was determined at all costs to avoid the fracas over preferences which has happened in Queensland in the looming federal election.
No shit.
The coalition, and particularly campaign director Andrew Robb, made a year-long effort to woo both the Greens and the environmental movement generally. The key was John Howard's announcement in early 1996 that the coalition would set up a $1.1 billion National Heritage Trust funded from the sale of a third of Telstra. It was clever politics. The then executive director of the Australia Institute, Clive Hamilton, described it as a hand grenade lobbed into the environment movement. The Wilderness Society's Alec Marr was convinced Labor were done for and was fighting bitterly with them behind the scenes, as Pamela Williams' book The Victory records. The Labor Party went absolutely feral, screaming down the phones at us. People talk about the Liberals having a born-to-rule mentality, but I've never seen arrogance, the like of which we saw in the Labor Party after 13 years. They told us we had nowhere else to go and that it didn't matter what we advocated, that our people would run over us and vote Labor anyway. Sound familiar?
So good that the Labor Party has changed since then, since 1996. Like, it is exactly the same thing that they would be saying now. And particularly the environment movement, right? Like, environment NGOs, I feel like, are in this particularly subservient kind of pathetic position in relation to Labor, where Labor has never been good on the environment. And yet, time and again, the environment movement just has to, like, put out their little cards on election day saying, oh, I guess you should probably vote Labor, and like endorse them every election and recommend that people preference them and all of that, because Labor's just like, no, you will do what I say, you little bitch.
Yeah. But yes, and we've talked about this a lot before with the Climate Council. Climate Council puts out climate targets. The Greens have the climate targets that actually align with what they say, and they go, but Labor's plan's good. Yes. And obviously that's happened with the ACF as well, which is pretty pro
Conservation
Labor
Council. Yeah.
And I guess it's just like we don't know what it would look like if you were representative of the broader environmental movement and lobbied hard and went after Labor and actually tried to push them and put pressure on them, right?
They're scaredy cats.
The split put the capital G Greens in a bind. Brown described Howard's National Heritage Trust as a quantum leap forward for the Liberal Party, the best environmental policy the Conservatives have come up with, but he refused to trade it for Telstra.
Good on him.
Is that the right cause? I mean, yes.
Absolutely.
This is definitely, yes, the right vibes. Privatising Telstra was a terrible idea, and standing firm on that is a good example, perhaps, of social economic policy trumping environmental considerations or fighting for both at the same time.
Yeah, this is one part of the book that made me quite proud. I was like, yeah, we have consistently probably been the only party to consistently stand up against privatisation, which, by the way, everyone fucking hates. We know, like, voters understand that privatisation is always a terrible idea. But Labor and the LNP love it.
They love it. Peter Singer's running for the Senate in Victoria. His own Senate candidacy generated a lot of interest, good and bad. Perhaps the worst moment for Singer came at a communications union rally in Melbourne opposing the sale of Telstra, at which he and Democrats leader Cheryl Kernot were invited to speak. Singer discovered that he'd been dropped from the bill because Kernot was refusing to share a platform with him. Before the rally, he confronted her publicly, demanding loudly to know why she had excluded him from the debate, and in scenes that looked terrible on the news that night, pursuing her through the crowd as she refused to answer. An upset Kernot asked him to show some human decency, just leave me alone. TV viewers were appalled.
Peter, no. But also, it's not explained in the book why she didn't want to share a platform with him. Is it the dog fucking stuff, or did that come later? Sorry, I assume Peter actually wanted to have sex with apes, right?
No, that's
allegedly. Sorry,
it was philosophical
allegedly.
policy. I don't think he wants to fuck animals. He's putting the thought out there that if an animal is free
he's
to
just asking questions. if there's a particularly sexy ape, who consents?
They have to be hot. They have to be an 11 out of 10. I don't know. Again, we don't know the reason why Kernot refused to share a platform with him. It's hard to tell whether it was because he was Peter Singer or because he was a Greens candidate. I mean, the Democrats were doing some pretty shitty stuff here.
Yeah.
And they really hated the Greens. I think the Democrats loved their centrism so much that they viewed the Greens as like ridiculous lefties.
Wow.
So it's hard to have an opinion on this unless we know the reason for that. But Peter Singer yelling at her in public, not a great move. And also very out of character, I would assume, from everything I've seen of Peter Singer. You know, he talks slowly, sort of thinks deeply about stuff. It's weird to imagine him yelling at a lady in public.
I'd have to see the footage. Like, obviously a terrible thing to do, but it's one of those things that I can sort of understand if someone was like, didn't want to stand next to you on stage, but didn't tell you why or didn't, then you would be like, what's going on? Cheryl, come back.
Talk me, please.
Cheryl.
When the question of preferences came up for the 1996 election, this is at Bob Brown's National Press Club address, Brown launched into both Labor and the Democrats. Labor could lose the election over the forests, he predicted, at least partly because the Greens had opted not to direct preferences to the party. Typically, when the party recommended it, some 75% of Green voters gave their preference to Labor, but that proportion dropped to 60% when the Greens issued a split ticket, as you mentioned.
Yeah, okay.
That difference alone could cost Labor 6 to 8 marginal seats, he predicted, including Bass. Brown also slammed the Democrats' preference allocations, which had put far-right groups like Call to Australia or Australians Against Further Immigration above the Greens.
Yeah,
Boo.
I'm learning a lot about the Democrats in this series as well, and they're shitter than I thought. I guess because some Democrats, after they collapsed, then went to the Greens, I sort of assumed that they were closer than it now appears.
Yeah, I mean, that could be their political evolution. You could also have, lots of, much like the Greens, people of lots of different disparate political ideologies attracted to the Democrats for a while because they were, for a time, one of the only alternatives. Yeah, broad church. 1996, of course, Keating is out. Little Johnny Howard wins. Congrats, Johnny.
Congrats.
Greens won 1.74% of the national vote. Bob Brown just gets elected to the Senate, beating the Democrats in Tasmania. Nationally, the Democrats do very, very well. They beat people all over the place. Peter Singer gets trounced, and they do quite well. Christabel Chamarette loses her spot as a WA senator. She's out.
Ah, we miss her.
Shout out to a real one. Critically, the election
Sorry, didn't it say as well that I think in the book it says something about her never having finished her doctoral thesis on the psychopathology of Parliament?
Yes.
Which I need to know more about.
Release what you have, Christabel, please.
Yeah.
Let us know. Yes. She was like, wow, this place is cooked. These people are psychos. I got to write a thing.
I absolutely understand wanting to do one of those.
Critically, the election split the environmental movement, both internally and from its natural political allies within Labor and the Greens. The movement's warm relationship with the Howard government did not last long, and there was a strong view that the Wilderness Society in particular had been tricked. Behind the scenes, Rob had struck a side deal with the forestry industry, whose workers agreed to keep quiet ahead of the election and trust that Howard would do nothing to hurt them. They were not disappointed. And I think this is perhaps the crucial factor, is like, you're playing the political games of preferences, but like, do you really think the Tories or the coalition will actually follow through on their environmental protection policies? Or
Exactly.
they will always prioritise the
Yeah.
interests of capital.
Yeah.
Among the Greens' lower house candidates in the 1996 federal election, Parnell and Boothby, Shane Rattenbury in Namadgi, Kim Herbert in Stirling and Jamie Parker in Bennelong would all later represent the party in state and territory parliaments. In the party's first tilt in the Northern Territory, euthanasia advocate Dr. Philip Nitschke polled well with 6.3%. Do you know Nitschke?
Yeah, vague. Yeah.
Big euthanasia guy. I did not realise he was a Greens candidate, but there you go.
I didn't know that either.
There was a post-election report which just sort of said all the messy preference deals was complicated, particularly drawing attention to the power of local branches, I suppose, to determine lower house preferences. Like, if we're going to do deals with parties, then I guess we have to be able to control them, was the general vibe.
How exactly does it work in Victoria? Like, is it the same in every state now, the way that preference recommendations are determined?
I remember having a branch meeting about this, yes, which was very brief and obvious. And we were like, us, Victorian Socialists above Labor, then Labor, and then all the crazy right-wing
You had a branch meeting about it?
Or maybe a campaign committee meeting, something like that.
Yeah, okay. Because we do, like in Queensland, we send out a ballot. Like there's an online ballot and every member individually votes in the ballot. But then you can designate you can say, I agree to let the Queensland Campaign Committee negotiate preferences on my behalf.
Oh, interesting.
But they're sort of then meant to take into account the results of the member ballot. But yeah, everyone votes in Queensland, but then
Okay. I mean, I guess, there's some logic to having branches because obviously there are different candidates, different parties running in different seats, and certain branches will have responsibility for a campaign in the federal seat. So it kind of makes sense. I mean, it just has never been sort of controversial, I think, from our point of view. Potentially, if the Victorian Socialists keep building support, I mean, that might become a more potent question. But again, I always think we should preference according to our values.
Yes.
Not because of
pretty
political
simple,
advantage.
actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
On the plus side, Parrott, this is the guy writing the post-election report for the Greens, noted that the party's membership had risen by half during the campaign. It had contested in a record number of seats, and its vote in both the lower and upper houses was comparable. Together, this demonstrated that the Greens represented a real political alternative, rather than simply seeking the balance of power in the Senate. We are not a lobby group. We are not a wing of the conservation movement. Other political parties perceive us as a party. Unionists perceive us as a political party. Community groups perceive us as a political party, the Greens political party. The voting public perceives us as a political party. At times, it seems to me that the only people having problems perceiving us as a political party are our own members. If we continue down this track, we will not fulfill our potential destiny. We will satisfy no one.
I do like this as a mantra every morning, though, in the mirror. Other political parties perceive us as a party. Unionists perceive us as a party. The voting public perceives us as a party.
I am a political party, and that is enough. Yeah.
I am a political party, and I will fulfill my potential destiny.
There you go. That's the end of Chapter 5 of Inside the Greens breaking through.
What's next?
Oh, sorry, I don't even know. Chapter 6, I assume.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6 is picking fights, I believe. Yes, picking fights.
Interesting.
Which we love to see. Yeah, there's been enough fighting going on. But I guess, we got Howard in power, and I don't know much about how the Greens played a role in the late 90s under the Howard government, but hopefully calling them shit on a regular basis. We've got Kyoto coming up. I guess we'll find out what happens.
We've got Iraq War surely coming up.
Iraq War's on the horizon. The Tampa situation, many
refugees. Good
to be fought. Thank you for making this possible. Hope you're enjoying this. As always, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, or just recommend Serious Danger to your friends and comrades. That would mean the world.
Going to a branch meeting? Why not just put your little hand up and recommend us? You know, all those nerds will love it.
Other business. This cool podcast that I know.
Exactly. Put it on the agenda.
Send us an email. You can message us through Patreon or send us an email anytime. hello@seriousdangerpod.com. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, and we love you, and good night. And you are a political party. I perceive you as a political party, and you will fulfill your potential destiny as a political party.
Serious Danger Australia.